Sometimes the greatest love story begins with the letter that was never meant to be found. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was not the silence inside Vaughn Manor. It was the absence of footsteps that everyone had unknowingly relied upon for years. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, Adrian Vaughn crossed the marble foyer with the same calm confidence, greeting every employee with a simple nod before disappearing into his private study. That morning, the clock chimed once, then twice, then a third time beyond its familiar schedule, yet the grand hallway remained empty. The staff exchanged uncertain glances but continued their work, convincing themselves he must have left before sunrise. By noon, the concern had spread through every room of the mansion. His car was still parked inside the garage. His phone rested untouched on the mahogany desk in his office. His favorite navy overcoat remained hanging beside the front entrance exactly where he had left it the evening before. Nothing suggested a hurried departure. Nothing suggested where he had gone. Grace Mitchell stood quietly near the back of the hallway, listening as the estate manager calmly organized the household. No one raised their voice. No one panicked. Yet every face carried the same unspoken question. Where had the master of the house gone without telling a single person? Grace had worked inside Vaughn Manor for almost 5 years. She knew every polished corridor, every antique clock, every ray of afternoon sunlight that drifted through the stained glass windows. She also knew Adrian Vaughn better than she admitted to herself. He was reserved, thoughtful, and impossible to read. He rarely lingered in conversation, yet he never forgot a birthday, never overlooked honest work, and somehow always noticed when someone needed help before they found the courage to ask. That quiet kindness had always confused Grace more than his reputation ever had. By late afternoon, the estate manager gently asked the staff to continue their daily routines while trusted associates searched for answers outside the mansion. Grace nodded and carried her cleaning basket toward the private study, believing the room would be untouched like every other day. She unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside. Warm afternoon light stretched across the enormous desk, illuminating shelves filled with leather-bound books and carefully organized files. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary until she noticed one small envelope resting alone in the center of the desk. It had not been there the evening before. Her heartbeat slowed as she walked closer. The cream-colored envelope was sealed with dark blue wax bearing the Vaughn family crest. Written across the front in elegant handwriting were only 2 words. For Grace. She stopped breathing for a moment. Her name. Not Miss Mitchell. Not to the house staff. Simply Grace. She looked around the silent office as though someone might explain why Adrian had written directly to her. The room offered only stillness. With trembling fingers, she carefully picked up the envelope. It felt surprisingly heavy, as though every unanswered question inside the mansion had somehow settled into a single folded sheet of paper. She hesitated, her thumb resting against the seal, uncertain whether opening it would betray his trust or finally reveal the truth everyone had been searching for. After one long breath, Grace gently broke the wax seal and unfolded the first page. The opening sentence stole every remaining thought from her mind. If you are reading this, Grace, then I have already left before finding the courage to tell you everything I should have said in person. Grace stood motionless beside Adrian's desk, the first sentence echoing through her thoughts until the quiet office seemed to disappear around her. She lowered herself into the leather chair across from where he usually worked, her hands trembling just enough to make the paper rustle softly. Outside the tall windows, autumn leaves drifted across the stone courtyard, but inside the study time appeared to stand completely still. She drew one careful breath and continued reading. Please do not blame yourself for my absence. You did not cause it, and you could never have stopped it. If anything, knowing you were here gave me the strength to stay much longer than I ever believed I could. Grace frowned with quiet confusion. Adrian had always carried himself with calm confidence. He solved every problem without raising his voice. He protected every member of the household with quiet dignity. She had never imagined there was a burden he could not carry alone. The next lines felt almost impossible to believe. You once told the gardener that flowers bloom because someone remembers to care for them every day. I do not think you realized I was standing on the balcony above you when you said it. I have remembered those words ever since. Grace slowly lowered the letter into her lap. The memory returned with startling clarity. It had happened almost 3 years earlier during a warm spring morning while she helped replant the rose garden after a late frost. She had believed only the elderly gardener had heard her simple remark. She never looked toward the balcony. She never knew Adrian had been there. Her heartbeat quickened as she lifted the letter again. You probably believed I never noticed the small things. The truth is that I noticed almost everything. I noticed that you always arrived 15 minutes before your shift began because you wanted the kitchen ready before everyone else woke up. I noticed that every Friday you packed extra bread from your own lunch to leave at the neighborhood shelter on your walk home. I noticed that you smiled at every employee, whether they were new or had worked here for decades. You brought kindness into this house without asking anyone to see it. Grace closed her eyes as tears quietly gathered beneath her lashes. Those were ordinary moments. They were never intended to impress anyone. She had carried them out because they felt right, never imagining another pair of eyes had quietly followed her routine with such careful attention. She looked around the office, seeing it differently now. The reading glasses resting beside the ledger, the untouched cup of tea near the window, the neatly stacked correspondence waiting for signatures. All of it suddenly felt less like the belongings of an untouchable man and more like the traces of someone who had spent years observing life through silence. She continued reading, her breathing growing slower with every sentence. If I seemed distant, it was never because you were invisible. It was because every conversation with you made it harder to pretend that my life could remain separate from yours. Grace felt the words settle deep within her heart. The man she had always believed impossible to understand was speaking more honestly through ink than he ever had through conversation. Yet she sensed the greatest truth had not been written yet. She carefully turned the page, unaware that the next paragraph would force her to question everything she had believed about Adrian Vaughn from the very first day she walked through the doors of Vaughn Manor. Grace slowly turned the page, her fingertips lingering on the edge of the paper as though moving too quickly might cause the words to disappear. Adrian's handwriting remained steady, every line as carefully composed as the man she had watched from a respectful distance for nearly 5 years. There is something I never allowed myself to tell you. You deserved honesty, but I convinced myself that silence was the kinder choice. I believed that if you saw me only as the quiet owner of this house, your future would remain free from the weight of my world. Grace read the sentence twice before continuing. Her memories carried her back to the first autumn she had worked at Vaughn Manor. Adrian had returned late one evening after a long day away from the estate. She had been placing fresh flowers in the entrance hall when he noticed a heavy box of seasonal decorations resting near the staircase. Without saying a word, he lifted it himself and carried it into the storage room before thanking her for staying late. She remembered standing there in surprise because no previous employer had ever thanked her for ordinary work. At the time she believed it was simply good manners. Now she wondered how many quiet moments she had misunderstood. The letter continued. Do you remember the old piano in the west sitting room? You apologized after accidentally striking one of the keys while dusting it. You looked around the room to see if anyone had heard the sound. I was standing in the hallway outside the door. Instead of closing it, I stayed there listening while you quietly played the melody your grandmother taught you as a little girl. It was the first time that mansion felt less like stone and wood and more like a home. Grace covered her mouth as another forgotten memory returned. She had believed the hallway was empty. She had played only a few gentle notes before becoming embarrassed and hurrying back to work. She never imagined Adrian had remained there, saying nothing so she would not feel uncomfortable. Her eyes filled with tears that blurred the ink before she carefully wiped them away and kept reading. People often assume they understand someone because they know their title. They knew me as a businessman. Others called me a powerful man. But you never treated me as either. You asked whether I had eaten after long meetings. You left fresh tea outside my study whenever I worked late. You reminded me that kindness survives even inside lonely places. Grace slowly looked around the office once again. The polished bookshelves, the framed photographs, the neatly organized desk no longer represented distance or authority. They reflected years of unnoticed conversations spoken through thoughtful gestures instead of words. Every cup of tea she had quietly left outside his office. Every flower she had arranged near the windows. Every simple greeting she offered each morning had somehow become part of a story she never knew Adrian had been writing in his heart. She lowered her gaze back to the final lines on the page. If I had been brave enough, I would have thanked you long before today. But there is one truth I have hidden even from myself, and before this letter ends, you deserve to know it. Grace's heartbeat quickened. She realized the letter was no longer simply explaining Adrian's disappearance. It was leading her toward a confession she had never imagined possible, one capable of changing every memory she had ever carried inside Vaughn Manor. Grace rested the letter on Adrian's desk for only a moment, pressing her fingertips against the polished mahogany as though she needed something solid to steady the emotions rising inside her. Outside, the afternoon sky had turned gray, and gentle rain began tapping softly against the tall windows of the study. The quiet rhythm seemed to accompany every word waiting on the next page. She lifted the letter again and continued reading. If you are wondering why I chose silence instead of honesty, the answer is not because I doubted your heart. It is because I doubted my right to ask anything of it. Grace felt her breath catch. Adrian had always appeared certain of every decision he made. Yet these words revealed a man who questioned himself far more than anyone had ever seen. She continued reading. There were many mornings when I wanted to stop you in the hallway and ask about your family, your dreams, or the book you carried during your lunch break. Instead, I simply wished you a good morning and walked away. Every step felt safer than risking yours. Grace remembered those mornings perfectly. She would greet him with a respectful smile while carrying fresh linens or flowers through the foyer. Adrian always answered with quiet kindness before disappearing into another meeting. She had mistaken his brief words for distance, never realizing they were the result of careful restraint. The next paragraph drew her deeper into memories she had almost forgotten. One December evening, the first heavy snow of the season covered the entire estate. Most of the staff had already gone home, but you stayed behind because the kitchen manager had fallen ill. You prepared dinner for everyone without being asked. You laughed with the gardeners, served the security team warm soup, and made certain the oldest housekeeper had a ride home before thinking about yourself. I watched all of it from the dining room doorway. That night, I understood something I could never admit aloud. The warmest place inside Vaughn Manor was never the fireplace. It was wherever you happened to be. Tears slowly slipped down Grace's cheeks. She had forgotten that evening entirely. To her, it had simply been the right thing to do. She never imagined someone had quietly carried that memory for years. She looked around Adrian's office once more and suddenly noticed details she had overlooked. Before, a small pressed white rose rested inside a glass paperweight near the window. It was identical to the flower she had once rescued after a storm damaged the garden. Beside it sat an old bookmark woven from blue ribbon, one she had absent-mindedly left inside a library novel months earlier. None of these objects belonged on the desk of a man consumed by business. Yet somehow they had remained there, preserved with quiet intention. Grace returned to the letter, her hands trembling slightly. You probably believed I forgot those little moments. The truth is that I surrounded myself with them because they reminded me that goodness still existed beyond ambition, responsibility, and expectation. You changed this house long before you ever realized you had changed me. Grace gently closed her eyes. Every sentence dissolved another misunderstanding she had carried for years. The man she believed had never truly seen her had remembered the smallest details of her life with astonishing clarity. But as she turned the page once more, she sensed the letter was about to reveal the reason Adrian had vanished, and suddenly the quiet study no longer felt like a place of memories. It felt like the beginning of a truth that had been waiting patiently for her all along. Grace held the final page she had just finished reading against her chest, but after only a brief moment, she carefully unfolded the next sheet, sensing that Adrian had finally reached the reason he had chosen to leave without a farewell. The rain outside had grown steadier, covering the windows with countless shimmering trails that blurred the gardens beyond the glass. The entire mansion seemed quieter than she had ever known it, as though even the walls were waiting for the next sentence. Adrian's handwriting remained calm and deliberate. There is one truth I have hidden from everyone, including myself, for far too long. If I had stayed, the people who depended on this house would eventually have carried burdens that belonged only to me. I could not allow that, especially not for you. Grace read the lines again, trying to understand. Adrian had never spoken dramatically. He always chose the simplest words. Yet every sentence seemed to hold an entire lifetime beneath its surface. She continued reading. Leaving was never about escaping responsibility. It was about finishing one responsibility before it reached the front door of Vaughn Manor. If I succeed, this house will remain exactly as you remember it. If I fail, I pray this letter reminds you that every choice I made began with gratitude, not regret. Grace slowly lowered the page, her eyes drifting around the study that had always reflected Adrian's quiet discipline. Every book stood perfectly aligned. Every file rested exactly where it belonged. Nothing suggested a man abandoning his life. Everything suggested someone expecting to return. Her gaze stopped at a framed photograph near the bookshelf. It showed the entire household gathered in the garden during the previous Christmas celebration. Grace stood in the back row beside the elderly housekeeper, laughing at something outside the camera's view. Adrian stood several feet away, smiling more openly than she had ever remembered. She had forgotten that picture existed. The next paragraph drew her attention back to the letter. If you were wondering whether I was afraid, the answer is yes. Not because I feared uncertainty. I feared leaving without thanking the one person who quietly reminded me that goodness still deserved a place in this world. You never asked for recognition. That is exactly why you deserved it. Tears slipped silently onto the paper before Grace gently brushed them away. She remembered every ordinary morning she had believed passed unnoticed. Watering the roses before sunrise. Leaving fresh tea outside his office. Straightening the books in the library after everyone had gone to bed. Those moments had seemed too small to matter. Yet somehow Adrian had carried every one of them with him. She turned to the final section of the letter resting before her. There is one last confession I owe you. It is not about why I left. It is about why returning has always been the only ending I have ever wanted. Grace's heartbeat quickened until she could hear nothing else. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she stared at those final words. She suddenly realized the letter had never been written as a goodbye. It had been written as a promise waiting for the day when the truth would finally bring two hearts back to the same place. And she knew the last page would change everything she believed about Adrian Vaughn and about the future that neither of them had ever dared to imagine together. Grace remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the final page as though every heartbeat depended on the words waiting beneath her fingertips. She slowly unfolded the last sheet, noticing that Adrian's handwriting had become slightly softer, not hurried, but more personal than anywhere else in the letter. It no longer sounded like the careful owner of Vaughn Manor speaking to one of his employees. It sounded like a man who had finally stopped hiding behind responsibility. If you have reached this page, then you already know that I never believed you were ordinary. I only feared that if I told you what was in my heart, I would ask you to carry a future you never chose. Grace felt tears gather once more. She remembered countless afternoons when she had quietly left fresh flowers outside his study, believing he rarely noticed them. Yet every page had proven otherwise. Adrian continued, "There is something I need you to understand before anyone tells you stories about where I have gone. I did not leave because I wished to disappear. I left because there were promises that only I could fulfill before I allowed myself to dream about a different life. Every mile I travel carries one hope with it. That one day I will return to this house knowing that everyone inside it is finally free to live without the shadows I spent years trying to keep outside these walls." Grace lowered the letter for a moment and looked around the office again. Nothing felt abandoned. The leather chair remained pushed neatly beneath the desk. His favorite fountain pen rested beside an unfinished notebook. Even the small porcelain cup she had placed there the previous evening had been washed and returned to its familiar place. Suddenly she understood. Adrian had not walked away from his home. He had walked towards something he believed would protect it. She lifted the page once more. There is one memory I have carried with me more faithfully than any document or achievement. It is the morning I found you standing alone in the eastern garden after a spring rain. You believed no one could see you smiling at the first rose that had survived the storm. I remember thinking that if a single flower could make someone grateful for another day, perhaps there was still hope for me as well. You reminded me that strength is often quiet, and kindness is never small. Grace closed her eyes, remembering that morning with perfect clarity. She had thought she was completely alone beneath the clearing sky. She never imagined Adrian had been watching from the library window. A gentle smile appeared through her tears as she realized how many beautiful moments they had unknowingly shared without speaking a single word about them. The final lines waited at the bottom of the page. Please do not spend your days searching for me. Live with the same generous heart that transformed this house. If fate is kind, I will find my way back to you when the time is finally right. Until then, know this above everything else. The greatest privilege of my life was never owning Vaughn Manor. It was meeting the woman who quietly taught me what home truly feels like. Grace carefully folded the letter against her heart, and for the first time since discovering Adrian's empty study, she no longer felt abandoned. She felt as though every word had gently guided her toward a truth that was still unfinished, and somewhere beyond the rain-covered windows, she sensed that this story had not ended with a farewell at all. It had only begun with a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Grace remained seated in Adrian's study long after the rain had faded into a gentle mist. The letter rested safely inside her hands, no longer feeling like a farewell, but like the first honest conversation they had ever shared. Every sentence had quietly dismantled the image she had carried of him for years. She had believed he was a distant man who lived behind polished doors and carefully measured words. Instead, she had discovered someone who remembered the smallest details of ordinary days, someone who treasured kindness more than power, and someone who had chosen silence because he believed it would protect the person he cared about most. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Before Grace could answer, the elderly estate manager stepped into the study carrying a wooden box polished smooth by time. His gentle eyes immediately settled on the folded letter resting in her hands. For a long moment, he said nothing, almost as though he had expected this moment to arrive one day. Finally, he smiled with quiet understanding. He hoped you would be the one to find it, he said softly. Grace looked up in surprise. You knew about the letter? The older man nodded. Only that it existed. Mr. Vaughn asked me to leave his study exactly as it was if he ever had to leave unexpectedly. He said that when the right person entered this room, everything would happen exactly as it should. Grace lowered her eyes toward the letter once more. Why did he trust me with something so personal? The estate manager gently placed the wooden box on Adrian's desk before answering. Because for years, you were the only person who treated him as a human being instead of a title. Grace felt emotion rise inside her once again. The manager carefully opened the box. Inside lay several neatly organized journals, each marked with a different year, alongside pressed flowers, handwritten notes, and small keepsakes that seemed ordinary at first glance. A blue ribbon, a dried white rose, a tiny ceramic bird. Grace immediately recognized every object. The ribbon had once fallen from a library book she borrowed. The rose came from the eastern garden after the spring storm Adrian described in his letter. The ceramic bird was a simple decoration she had quietly repaired after accidentally dropping it while dusting the windowsill. He kept all of these, she whispered in disbelief. The estate manager smiled. He said they reminded him that beauty rarely announces itself. It simply appears through people who never expect to be noticed. Grace carefully lifted the little ceramic bird into her hands, amazed that something she once considered insignificant had become part of Adrian's most treasured memories. She realized that the journals were not records of business meetings or financial accounts. Their worn pages contained sketches of the gardens through changing seasons, observations about the household, reflections on gratitude, and quiet reminders to appreciate moments that could never be repeated. Grace slowly turned toward the window overlooking the eastern garden. The clouds had begun to separate, allowing warm evening sunlight to spill across the stone pathways, where fresh rain still shimmered like tiny mirrors. She remembered Adrian's final promise. He had not asked her to wait in sadness. He had asked her to continue living with kindness until the day their paths crossed again. For the first time since the empty morning began, Grace smiled without tears. Deep inside her heart, hope no longer felt impossible. It felt patient. And somewhere beyond the peaceful gardens surrounding Vaughn Manor, she believed that Adrian Vaughn had not vanished from her life forever. He had simply entrusted the next chapter to time itself. The following morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air, washing the gardens of Vaughn Manor in soft golden light that seemed almost impossible after the long rain. Grace woke earlier than usual, carrying Adrian's folded letter inside the pocket of her apron instead of leaving it locked away in her room. She could not explain why, but having his words close to her heart gave every ordinary task a different meaning. As she opened the curtains throughout the mansion, polished the silver railings, and arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases, she noticed details she had overlooked for years. Every room reflected Adrian's quiet appreciation for simple beauty. Fresh sunlight filled the library where he had spent countless evenings reading. The eastern garden glowed beneath dew-covered roses that had survived another season. The old grandfather clock echoed through the hallway with the same steady rhythm that had greeted every morning of her 5 years in the house. Nothing around her had changed, yet everything felt different because she finally understood the person who had carefully shaped this place. Near midday, the elderly estate manager approached Grace carrying a small envelope sealed with the same dark blue wax she recognized from Adrian's letter. "He instructed me to give you this only after you finished reading everything else," he explained gently. Grace accepted it with quiet surprise. The envelope contained only a single handwritten note. "Please visit the Eastern Garden whenever you begin to doubt what you have read." Without hesitation, she walked through the open terrace doors toward the familiar stone pathway leading beneath the ancient oak tree. A cool breeze carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass as sunlight filtered gently through the branches overhead. She reached the wooden bench where she often spent her lunch breaks reading library books and noticed something she had never seen before. Beneath the bench, carefully protected inside a weatherproof wooden compartment, rested a small leather journal. Attached to its cover was another handwritten message in Adrian's unmistakable script. "Some memories deserve a quieter place than a desk." Grace opened the journal with careful hands. Instead of business notes, every page contained observations about the changing seasons, sketches of the gardens, reflections on gratitude, and brief memories connected to ordinary moments around the estate. One page described the spring morning when Grace rescued a robin with an injured wing before releasing it days later. Another remembered how she stayed late decorating the dining hall for an elderly housekeeper's retirement celebration because she believed everyone deserved to feel appreciated. Adrian had quietly recorded dozens of moments that Grace herself had nearly forgotten. None of them involved wealth or success. Every memory celebrated kindness, patience, or compassion. Near the final pages, she found a pressed rose resting beside one simple sentence. "If there is one place where I always believed hope could wait for me, it is here." Grace gently touched the preserved flower, her eyes filling once again with quiet emotion. She suddenly realized Adrian had not left behind riches or instructions for the future. He had left behind proof that love could be built from countless unnoticed moments gathered patiently over time. As she closed the journal and looked across the peaceful garden, the distant sound of tires rolling over the long gravel driveway drifted through the still afternoon air. It was not loud enough to disturb the quiet, but it was unfamiliar enough to make every member of the household slowly lift their eyes toward the front entrance. And without understanding why, Grace felt her heart begin to race with a hope she had promised herself not to expect. Grace slowly rose from the wooden bench, the leather journal and Adrian's letter held carefully against her heart as though they had become part of her. Around the estate, the staff quietly gathered near the front entrance, their expressions filled with the same cautious curiosity that had followed them since Adrian's unexpected departure. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew clearer until a black sedan came to a gentle stop beneath the circular driveway. No one spoke. Even the breeze seemed to pause among the rose bushes lining the stone path. The driver's door opened first, followed by the rear passenger door. Grace found herself unable to breathe as a familiar pair of polished shoes touched the gravel. Adrian Vaughn stepped into the afternoon sunlight wearing the same quiet composure that had always defined him, though something in his expression had changed. The burden she had never realized he carried seemed lighter now, replaced by a calm warmth that reached his eyes before a single word was spoken. The estate manager smiled softly and lowered his head with unmistakable relief. One by one, the household staff returned to their work, instinctively understanding that the moment unfolding before them belonged to two people whose story had waited patiently for time to complete its own sentence. Adrian walked toward Grace without haste. Every step reflected the same respect he had shown throughout the letter. He did not expect forgiveness. He did not assume anything had remained unchanged. He simply stopped a few feet away and looked at her with quiet sincerity. Grace searched his face, realizing that she was no longer looking at the distant man she believed she had known for years. She was seeing the person revealed between every handwritten line. The man who remembered forgotten flowers, ordinary mornings, simple conversations, and countless acts of kindness no one else had ever noticed. She gently lifted the folded letter between them. "I read every word," she whispered. Adrian nodded. "I hoped you would." Grace smiled through grateful tears. "I spent years believing silence meant indifference." Adrian answered with the same honesty that had transformed every page she had read. "And I spent years believing silence would protect the people I cared about." For a long moment, neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left to explain because the truth had already found its way into the open. Grace carefully placed the letter back into his hands before closing his fingers around it. "It belongs to both of us now," she said softly. Adrian looked at the familiar pages, then gently shook his head. "No," he replied with a peaceful smile. "It brought me back to the only place I ever wanted to return. It belongs to you." Grace reached into her apron pocket and removed the small pressed rose she had found inside the journal. She placed it inside the letter before folding it once again. Neither of them needed promises written in ink anymore. They had already discovered something stronger through patience, honesty, and the courage to finally speak. Together they turned toward Vaughn Manor, where warm afternoon light poured through the open front doors and filled the entrance hall with quiet welcome. The mansion no longer felt like a place waiting for someone to come home. Home had already found its way back through two hearts that finally understood one another. As they walked side by side across the familiar marble floor, Grace realized that Adrian's greatest gift had never been the letter itself. It was the chance to replace every misunderstanding with truth, every silence with trust, and every ordinary day ahead with hope. And on that peaceful afternoon, without grand declarations or impossible miracles, they discovered that the strongest love is not the one that arrives without trials, but the one that returns with deeper understanding, unwavering respect, and a heart finally brave enough to stay.